someone was hammering against an anvil somewhere very, very close to her head. So close that she felt each beat in her body, the sound shattering through her mind, stirring her from sleep. With a jolt, Celanea sat up. There was no hammer and no anvil, just a pounding headache. And there was no assassin's fortress, only endless miles of red dunes, and Cassida standing watch over her. Well, at least she wasn't dead. Cursing, she got to her feet. What had Ansel done? The moon illuminated enough of the desert for her to see that the assassin's fortress was nowhere in sight, and Cassida's saddlebags were full of her belongings. Except for her sword. She searched and searched, but it wasn't there. Celanea reached for one of her long daggers, but stiffened when she felt a scroll of paper tucked into her belt. Someone had also left a lantern beside her, and it took only a few moments for Celanea to get it lit and nestled into the dune. Kneeling before the dim light, she unrolled the paper with shaking hands. It was in Ansel's handwriting, and wasn't long.
I'm sorry it had to end this way. The Master said it would be easier to let you go like this, rather than shame you by publicly asking you to leave early. Cassida is yours, as is the Master's letter of approval, which is in the saddlebag. Go home. I will miss you. Ansel.
Celanea read the letter 3 times to make sure she hadn't missed something. She was being let go? But why? She had the letter of approval at least, but what had she done that made it so urgent to get rid of her that he drugged her and then dumped her in the middle of the desert? She had 5 days left. He couldn't have waited for her to leave. Her eyes burned as she sought through the events of the past few days for ways she might have offended the Master. She got to her feet and rifled through the saddlebags until she pulled out the letter of approval. It was a folded square of paper, sealed with the sea green wax the colour of the Master's eyes. A little vain, but... Her fingers hovered over the seal. If she broke it, then Arobin might accuse her of tampering with the letter. But what if it said horrible things about her? Ansel said it was a letter of approval, so it couldn't be that bad. Celanea tucked the letter back into the saddlebag. Perhaps the Master had also realised that she was spoilt and selfish. Maybe everyone had just been tolerating her. And maybe they'd heard of her fight with Ansel and decided to send her packing. It wouldn't surprise her. They were looking out for their own after all. Never mind that for a while. She had felt like one of their own. Felt for the first time in a long, long while, like she had a place where she belonged. Where she might learn something more than deceit and how to end lives. But she'd been wrong. Somehow. Realising that hurt far worse than the beating Arobin had given her. Her lips trembled, but she squared her shoulders and scanned the night sky until she found the stag and the crowning star that led north. Sighing, Celanea blew out the lantern, mounted Cassida, and rode into the night. She rode towards Xandria, opting to find a ship there instead of braving the north trek across the singing sands to Yorpa, the port she'd originally sailed to. Without a guide, she didn't really have much of a choice. She took her time, often walking instead of riding Cassida, who seemed as sad as she was to leave the silent assassins and their luxury stables. The next day, she was a few miles into her late afternoon trek when she heard thump, Thump.
Huh?
Thump.
Oh.
It grew louder, the movements now edged with clashing and clattering and deep voices. She hopped onto Cassida's back and crested a dune. In the distance, at least 200 men were marching straight into the desert. Some bore red and black banners, Lord Berik's men. They marched in a long column, with mounted soldiers galloping along the flanks. Though she'd never seen Berik, a quick examination of the host showed no sign of a lord being present. He must have stayed behind. But there was nothing out here. Nothing except for... Celena's mouth went dry. Nothing except the silent assassin's fortress. A mounted soldier paused his riding, his black mare gleaming with sweat. He stared towards her. With her white clothes concealing all of her but her eyes, he had no way of identifying her. No way of telling what she was. Even from the distance, she could see the bow and quiver of arrows he bore. How good was his aim? She didn't dare move. The last thing she needed was the attention of all those soldiers on her. They all possessed broadswords, daggers, shields, and arrows. This definitely wasn't going to be a friendly visit. Not with this many men. Was that why the master had sent her away? Had he somehow known this would happen and didn't want her caught up in it? Celanea nodded to the soldier and continued riding towards Xandria. If the master didn't want anything to do with her, then she certainly didn't need to warn them, especially since he probably knew. And he had a fortress full of assassins. 200 soldiers was nothing compared to the 70 or so of the Sessiz Suikast. The assassins could handle themselves. They didn't need her. They'd made that clear enough. Still, the muffled thump of Cassida's steps away from the fortress became more and more difficult to bear. The next morning, Xandria was remarkably quiet. At first, Celanea thought it was because the citizens were all waiting for news about the attack on the assassins, but soon she realized she found it quiet because she had only seen it on market day. The winding narrow streets that were crammed with vendors were now empty, littered with errant palm fronds and sand that slithered in the fierce winds from the sea. She bought passage on a ship that would sail to Amia, the port in Melisande across the Gulf of Oro. She'd hoped for a ship to Inish, another port, so she could inquire after the young healer she'd met on the journey here. But there were none. And with the embargo on ships from Xandria going to other parts of Ardalan's empire, a distant, forgotten port like Amia would be her best bet. From there, she'd travel on Cassida's back to Rifthold, hopefully catching another boat somewhere along the long arm of the Avery River that would take her the last leg to the capital. The ship didn't leave until high tide that afternoon, which left Celanea with a few hours to wander the city. The spider silk merchant was long gone, along with the cobbler and the temple priestesses. Nervous that the mare could be identified in the city, but more worried that someone would steal Cassida if she left her unguarded, Celanea led the horse through back alleys until she found a near private trough for Cassida. Celanea leaned against a sandstone wall as her horse drank her fill. Had Lord Berik's men reached the fortress yet? At the rate they were going, they would probably arrive this night or early tomorrow morning. She just hoped the master was prepared, and that he had at least restocked the flaming wall after the last attack from Berik. Had he sent her away for her own safety? Or was he about to be blindsided? She glanced up at the palace towering over the city. Berik hadn't been with his men. Delivering the Mute Master's head to the king of Ardalan would surely get the embargo lifted from his city. Was he doing it for the sake of his people, or for himself? But the Red Desert also needed the assassins, and the money and trade the foreign emissaries brought in too. Berik and the Master had certainly been communicating in the past few weeks. What had gone wrong? Ansel had made another trip a week ago to see him, and hadn't mentioned trouble. She seemed quite jovial, actually. Celanea didn't know why a chill snaked down her spine in that moment, or why she found herself suddenly digging through the saddlebags until she pulled out the Master's letter of approval, along with the note Ansel had written her. If the Master had known about the attack, he would have been fortifying his defences already. He wouldn't have sent Celanea away. She was Ardalan's greatest assassin, and if 200 men were marching on his fortress, he'd need her. The Master wasn't proud, not like a Robin. He truly loved his disciples. He looked after and nurtured them. But he'd never trained Ansel. Why? And with so many of his loved ones in the fortress, why send only Celanea away? Why not send them all? Her heart beat so fast it stumbled, and Celanea tore open the letter of approval. It was blank. She flipped over the paper. The other side was also blank. Holding it up to the sun revealed no hidden ink, no watermark. But it had been sealed by him, hadn't it? That was his seal on the... It was easy to steal a signet ring. She'd done it with Captain Rolfe. And she'd seen the white line around the Master's finger. His ring had been missing. But if Ansel had drugged her and given her a document sealed with the Master's signet ring... No, it wasn't possible. And it didn't make sense. Why would Ansel send her away and pretend the Master had done it? Unless... Celanea looked up at Lord Berik's palace. Unless Ansel hadn't been visiting Lord Berik on behalf of the Master at all. Or maybe she had been at first. Long enough to gain the Master's trust. But while the Master thought she was mending the relationship between them, Ansel was really doing quite the opposite. And the spider silk merchant had mentioned something about a spy among the assassins. A spy working for Berik. But why? Celanea didn't have time to ponder it, not with 200 men so close to the fortress. She might have questioned Lord Berik, but that too would take precious time. One warrior might not make a difference against 200, but she was Celanea Saradothin. That had to count for something. That did count for something. She mounted Cassida and turned her towards the city gates. "Let's see how fast you can run," she whispered into the mare's ear, and took off,